Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring the world of DMT and ayahuasca,
Oh, yeah,
looking at all the ways these compounds can affect the brain.
right.
You sent over some really interesting research, actually a research review on the neuroscience.
Yeah.
We're going to be trying to break it down for everyone today.
It's a fascinating area.
That is, it
There
is.
is a lot of excitement and kind of buzz around DMT and ayahuasca and
Mhm.
how they might give us a deeper understanding of consciousness and how
Yeah.
the brain works.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that buzz is also around the potential for using them to treat some really tough mental health conditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, I think we should start by just getting on the same page
Yeah.
with the basics for people who might not be as familiar. So DMT is sometimes called N-dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful hallucinogen, and what's really interesting is it's found naturally in the human body.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes DMT so captivating, right?
Right.
Because we know it exists within us,
Yes.
but the exact function is still unknown.
It's like a puzzle.
It's like a built-in puzzle piece of our own biology just
Yeah.
waiting to be solved.
But DMT is also the main psychoactive component in ayahuasca, right?
Exactly.
And ayahuasca is a brew that's been used for centuries and centuries
Yeah.
in spiritual and healing ceremonies, mostly in South and Mesoamerica.
Yeah, traditionally made by brewing the Banisteriopsis caapi vine with other plants that contain DMT.
Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't know. You can't just eat DMT
Right.
and expect to have like an ayahuasca experience.
You can't.
Taken orally on its own, your body breaks it down way too quickly
That's right.
to have any effect. That's where the B-caapi vine comes in.
Exactly.
What is so special about this vine?
Well, it contains compounds called MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and those MAOIs prevent the breakdown of DMT.
So it's like a key.
It is.
It unlocks the door for the DMT to get into the brain and do its thing.
Exactly. That's why B-caapi is a crucial part of the ayahuasca brew. By combining the two, DMT can stay active in the system for hours.
Oh, wow.
And that's what leads to those really profound effects that people report.
And I mean, we're talking vivid hallucinations,
Yeah.
this blending of the senses where you might hear colors or see sounds, and even a sense of like expanded consciousness.
Yeah, and it's often described as intensely visual and emotional.
I can imagine.
Yeah, imagine a swirling kaleidoscope of colors and patterns, encounters with mystical beings, profound insights into yourself and the universe.
It must be overwhelming.
It can be quite overwhelming, especially for first-timers.
And then on top of all of that, there are often physical effects too, right? Like the purging,
Yeah, the
the
vomiting.
diarrhea.
Yeah, and traditionally that's seen as a necessary part of the healing process.
Oh, really?
A physical and emotional cleansing.
Yeah, not exactly a spa day.
No, not quite.
Yeah.
But in those traditional settings, the purging is seen as a release,
Yeah.
a way to let go of negative energies or emotional baggage.
So, okay, we have this potent substance that's also found in our brains, brewed into this really potent concoction.
Yeah,
And then people are having these incredible journeys.
right.
But what is actually happening in the brain?
Well, neuroscientists have been using brain imaging techniques like fMRI and EEG to kind of peek inside the brain during these ayahuasca experiences.
Wow. So they can actually see.
Yeah, and they've found some pretty interesting things.
Like what?
One of the most fascinating discoveries, I think, is that DMT seems to disrupt the usual hierarchy of brain activity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, imagine like a symphony orchestra, right?
Sure.
And suddenly everyone starts improvising instead of following the conductor.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of what's happening in the brain on DMT.
So it's not just one part of the brain lighting up.
Right. It's more like DMT is shaking things up and letting different parts of the brain communicate in new ways.
Which would explain that feeling of ego dissolution that people talk about.
Exactly. Where the boundaries between the self and the outside world just seem to dissolve.
And this is all happening because DMT is targeting one specific area in the brain.
Well, it's definitely more complex than just targeting one area.
Oh, okay.
DMT interacts with a wide array of receptors in the brain, particularly those for serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that plays a big role in mood and perception and a lot of other functions.
Right, serotonin.
And while it's true that the serotonin 2A receptor is really important,
Okay.
DMT doesn't limit itself to that one. It also interacts with other serotonin receptors like 5-HT1A and 5-HT2C.
So it's more nuanced than just saying that psychedelics only work on one serotonin receptor.
It is. It's like an intricate dance involving various neurotransmitters and receptors, each contributing to the overall psychedelic experience.
And we've talked about DMT on its own and how if you just eat it, it doesn't really do anything.
Right.
But how does combining it with those MAOIs in the ayahuasca brew, how does that affect things?
Well, the carbolines in ayahuasca, like harmaline, and tetrahydroharmone,
Huh.
they're not just MAOIs.
Or
They also have their own effects on the brain, potentially interacting with various receptors and systems.
interesting.
Like, for example, harmine has shown some intriguing antidepressant-like effects in preclinical studies.
So ayahuasca is more than just the sum of its parts.
It is.
It's this really complex interplay of these different compounds,
Yeah.
each with its own unique properties,
I mean,
and it creates this symphony of effects in the brain.
symphony of effects. I like that.
And speaking of complexity, the research you sent over really dives into this concept of neuroplasticity,
Ah, yes, neuroplasticity.
the brain's ability to change and rewire itself.
It's remarkable. It's like a constantly evolving landscape, shaping and reshaping itself in response to our experiences.
And what's really exciting is that research is showing that both DMT and ayahuasca, they can actually enhance neuroplasticity.
They can.
It's like they act like a fertilizer for the brain, encouraging the growth of new brain cells and connections.
It's incredible. It makes you wonder if this is why people report feeling so transformed after these ayahuasca experiences.
Like, it's giving the brain a chance to break free from those old ingrained patterns and create new pathways.
Exactly.
It's mind-boggling to think about the implications. Could this be the key to treating things like depression and anxiety addiction, even PTSD?
That's what researchers are exploring right now. There's a lot of excitement around the possibility of using these substances to help people overcome these mental health challenges that have been so difficult to treat with conventional methods.
It feels like we're on the edge of a new chapter in understanding the brain and its potential for healing.
It does.
But before we get too far ahead, let's dive a little deeper into this research on neuroplasticity.
Okay.
What are some of the key findings that connect DMT and ayahuasca to these changes in the brain?
Well, one of the key players in this whole neuroplasticity puzzle seems to be BDNF.
BDNF.
Yeah, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this protein is like a master gardener for the brain.
Okay.
It nurtures the growth of new brain cells and connections.
So it's like DMT and ayahuasca give BDNF a boost, and then that leads to this flourishing of new neural pathways.
That's the idea.
That's incredible. What
Yeah.
kind of impact does that have on someone's brain?
Well, there's research showing that DMP can actually increase dendritic spine density.
Dendritic spine density.
Yeah, so think of these spines as like the tiny branches on brain cells
Okay.
that allow them to connect and communicate with each other.
Okay.
And DMT seems to encourage these branches to grow and flourish.
So it's not just about growing new brain cells, it's also about,
It's about strengthening those communication networks between them.
wow, and that makes the brain more interconnected.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Okay, so what else?
Oh, there's also research suggesting that DMT can increase the excitability of neurons,
Okay.
particularly in the prefrontal cortex.
Hold on, the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
That's like the CEO of the brain, right?
You got
The
it.
part that handles all the planning and decision making and
It's the part of the brain that helps us regulate our emotions, make sense of the world, navigate complex social situations.
and DMT might be enhancing the activity of that part of the brain.
It seems that way.
That seems like a big deal.
It is a big deal,
Yeah.
especially when we consider the implications for treating conditions like depression, which often involve dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
It's like DMT might be helping to re-energize and revitalize this key area of the brain.
This is all so mind-blowing. You know, we produce this substance naturally. It can be brewed into this ancient concoction.
Right.
And now we're finding that it might actually help the brain rewire itself.
I know, it's pretty amazing.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
What else don't we know about DMT and ayahuasca?
Well, we've only just begun to explore the depths of these substances and their potential to impact human consciousness and well-being. And while the current research is really exciting, it's important to remember that it's still early days.
Right. There's still so much more to uncover. But the findings so far are definitely promising, particularly when it comes to potential therapeutic applications. I'm especially intrigued by those observational studies looking at long-term ayahuasca users in religious contexts.
Yeah, those studies are really interesting.
What have they found?
Well, they suggest that long-term ayahuasca use might be linked to some pretty significant psychological and even brain changes.
Like, what kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, for instance, some studies have found that people who regularly participate in ayahuasca ceremonies tend to score lower on measures of harm avoidance.
Harm avoidance.
Yeah, so they seem to be less afraid of taking risks or exploring new experiences.
So it's not just about the immediate psychedelic experience.
Right. It seems like ayahuasca might actually lead to lasting personality shifts.
That's wild.
Okay, what else? Well, long-term ayahuasca users also tend to score higher on measures of self-transcendence.
Self-transcendence.
Yeah, so they report feeling a greater sense of connection to something larger than themselves, a deeper sense of purpose and meaning in life.
Which makes sense when you think about how people often describe ayahuasca experiences as spiritual or mystical.
Okay.
Maybe these long-term changes in personality are reflecting a shift in how people view themselves and their place in the universe.
That's a fascinating possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not forget the reports of improvements in mental health with reductions in things like anxiety and depression.
So it's not just a temporary high. There might be lasting benefits.
It seems that way. Of course, it's important to note that these observational studies can't definitively prove that ayahuasca caused these changes. It's possible that people who are drawn to ayahuasca already possess some of these personality traits.
That's true. More research is needed to really tease apart the cause and effect.
Definitely.
But still, the findings are pretty compelling.
They are.
And we know that ayahuasca can impact the brain in all sorts of ways.
Right.
But what about the actual structure of the brain?
Mhm.
Does long-term ayahuasca use lead to any visible changes in brain anatomy?
Well, there have been some really interesting findings from structural MRI studies.
Okay, this is where it gets really juicy. Tell me more.
Some studies have found that long-term ayahuasca users actually show cortical thinning in certain areas of the brain.
Cortical thinning?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, is thinner in certain areas.
Okay.
And the really interesting part is that this thinning seems to be most prominent in regions that are associated with the default mode network.
Okay, back up for a second. What is the default mode network again?
So the default mode network is a network of brain regions that's active when we're not focused on any particular task.
Okay.
It's the part of the brain that's engaged when we're daydreaming, lost in thought, ruminating about the past or future.
So the default mode network is like the brain's autopilot.
Exactly. Always humming along in the background.
And ayahuasca seems to be linked to a thinning of this network.
It does.
So ayahuasca might be quieting down the very part of the brain that's responsible for our self-absorbed thoughts.
That's one interpretation.
That's wild. And this cortical thinning, it's correlated with how long people have been using ayahuasca.
It is. The more experience people have with the brew, the more pronounced these structural changes seem to be.
It makes you wonder if this is why people often report that feeling of ego dissolution during ayahuasca experiences.
Yeah, like the boundaries of the self are dissolving and they're merging with something larger.
Right.
It's definitely a possibility. And there's some evidence to support that idea. Research has shown that this thinning in the default mode network is also associated with increased levels of mindfulness and self-awareness.
So maybe ayahuasca is helping people become more present, more aware of their thoughts and feelings, less caught up in the stories they tell themselves.
It's a very compelling idea.
Yeah.
And it really challenges our understanding of how the brain works and how our sense of self is constructed.
It's almost like ayahuasca is giving the brain a chance to step outside of its usual patterns and explore new ways of being.
Exactly. And while more research is needed to fully understand the long-term effects of ayahuasca on the brain, the findings so far are incredibly intriguing. They suggest that this ancient brew might hold the key to unlocking profound changes in our brains and our consciousness.
It's amazing to think that this plant medicine, used for centuries in indigenous cultures, might be capable of inducing these structural changes in the brain, potentially leading to lasting psychological benefits.
It's a testament to the power of nature and the wisdom of ancient traditions. But amidst all this excitement, it's crucial to remember that ayahuasca is a powerful substance and should be approached with caution and respect.
That's a really important point. We can't just gloss over the potential risks. Ayahuasca isn't for everyone, and it can be a very challenging experience, even in the right setting.
You're absolutely right. While there's growing evidence for the potential benefits of ayahuasca, it's crucial to acknowledge that it can have risks, especially if it's not used responsibly.
So let's talk about those risks. What are some of the things people should be aware of?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, ayahuasca often causes purging.
Right.
And that can be very intense and unpleasant for some people. And for others, it can trigger really difficult psychological experiences like anxiety, fear, or even temporary psychosis.
So it's not all rainbows and unicorns.
No, it's not.
People need to go into this with their eyes wide open.
Absolutely. Ayahuasca is not a recreational drug. It's a powerful tool that should be treated with respect and careful consideration.
So for someone who is considering exploring ayahuasca, what does responsible use look like?
Well, first and foremost, do your research. It's essential to find a reputable source, ideally a traditional setting or a well-established retreat center with experienced facilitators who can guide you through the experience safely.
I can imagine that set and setting play a huge role in how the experience unfolds.
They absolutely do. The environment, the people you're with, your mental and emotional state going into the experience, all of these factors can influence how ayahuasca affects you.
What about medical considerations?
Yeah?
Are there any health conditions or medications that might make ayahuasca use risky?
Yes, definitely. It's crucial to be aware of potential contraindications and interactions. People with certain heart conditions or high blood pressure should avoid ayahuasca as it can elevate heart rate and blood pressure. And it's essential to be aware of potential interactions with other medications, especially antidepressants. Combining ayahuasca with certain antidepressants can be dangerous, even potentially fatal.
So talking to your doctor beforehand is a must.
Absolutely. A thorough conversation with your doctor about your health history and any medications you're taking is essential before even considering using ayahuasca.
Safety first, always. We've talked a lot about brain imaging and EEG studies.
We have.
But I'm curious, how are scientists actually measuring those brain changes associated with DMT and ayahuasca use? What are some of the tools they're using?
Well, as we've discussed, fMRI, which measures changes in blood flow in the brain to indicate activity, and EEG, which records electrical activity in the brain using electrodes placed on the scalp, are the big ones.
Right, those are like the workhorses of brain research.
They are.
But are there any other tools that researchers are using to delve deeper into the mysteries of DMT and the brain?
Yes. There are some other techniques like MRS or magnetic resonance spectroscopy,
Okay.
which allows researchers to measure the concentration of specific chemicals in the brain. This gives us a glimpse into the neurochemical changes associated with these substances.
So instead of just seeing which brain areas light up,
Right.
we can actually see how the chemical landscape of the brain changes.
Exactly. It's a way to see how these substances are actually altering the levels of neurotransmitters and other key players in brain function.
That's so cool. What about those structural changes in the brain?
Yeah.
Like the cortical thinning we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
How are those changes actually measured?
So structural MRI can provide really detailed images of the brain,
Okay.
allowing researchers to measure the thickness of different brain regions and even the volume of gray matter and white matter.
So it's like taking precise measurements of the brain's architecture.
Precisely. And by comparing these brain maps between long-term ayahuasca users and those who don't use it, researchers can start to identify structural differences that might be related to ayahuasca use.
It's amazing that we can actually see these changes happening in the brain. It makes you realize just how dynamic and adaptable our brains really are.
It does. And it underscores the profound impact that experiences, including those induced by powerful substances like DMT and ayahuasca, can have on our brains and our consciousness.
It's like a whole new frontier of neuroscience, uncovering the brain's potential to heal and transform in ways we never thought possible.
But it seems like every answer just leads to more questions.
That's the beauty of science. It's
Yeah.
an endless pursuit of knowledge and understanding.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
You're right, there's still so much more to discover. Well, on that note, let's take a moment to gather our thoughts and reflect on what we've learned so far. We'll be right back to wrap things up and explore what all of this means for you, the listener, and for the future of research into these fascinating substances. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the world of DMT and ayahuasca.
Yes.
We've gone over a lot, the science, the potential benefits, the risks.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in. So let's kind of shift gears for a minute and think about what all of this means for you, the listener.
Okay.
What are the key takeaways you can walk away with?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that the research on DMT and ayahuasca, it's constantly evolving. We're only just beginning to unravel the mysteries of how these substances work in the brain and what their potential impact is on human consciousness and health.
It's like we're at the edge of a new frontier.
Exactly. With a vast landscape of knowledge still waiting to be explored.
And this research isn't just about understanding these specific substances.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to develop new therapies and approaches to healing.
Exactly. particularly for conditions that have been so difficult to treat with traditional methods.
So we're talking about things like depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD.
Precisely. Conditions that cause so much suffering and for which we desperately need more effective treatments.
And I think the possibility of using DMT and ayahuasca to help people who are struggling with these conditions, it's really exciting.
It is incredibly exciting.
It's like a paradigm shift in how we think about mental health treatment.
Yeah, it's not just about managing symptoms anymore. It's about promoting deep healing and transformation at the level of the brain and the mind.
And the research on neuroplasticity that we were talking about earlier, that's really key here.
It is.
The fact that DMT and ayahuasca, they might actually be able to promote the growth of new brain cells and connections, that opens up so many possibilities.
Absolutely. It's like giving the brain a chance to break free from those deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior that can keep people trapped in cycles of suffering. It's about creating new pathways, new possibilities for healing and growth.
It's such a powerful and hopeful idea. But with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Absolutely.
These substances are powerful tools, and it's so important to approach them with the utmost respect, intention, and guidance.
Especially with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
It's not something to be taken lightly. It's a sacred medicine, often used in ceremonial contexts, and it should be treated with reverence and care. Finding a reputable source, a safe setting, and experienced facilitators is absolutely crucial.
It's like the difference between going on a solo trek through the wilderness versus having an experienced guide by your side.
Exactly.
The journey can be challenging, and having that support can make all the difference.
Absolutely. Ayahuasca can take you to some pretty wild places, both internally and externally. And having that experienced guidance can help you navigate those challenges and integrate the insights that you gain along the way.
So what does the future hold for research in this field? Where do we go from here?
I think one of the most important things is to continue exploring those mechanisms of action, to really get down to the nitty-gritty of how DMT and ayahuasca are affecting the brain at a molecular level.
So more of those brain imaging studies, EEG recordings, and the chemical measurements that we were talking about,
Yes, please.
continuing to refine our understanding of how these substances are actually working.
And those tools and techniques, they're becoming increasingly sophisticated, allowing us to probe the brain with greater precision and detail than ever before.
What about clinical trials?
Yeah.
Are we going to see these substances become legitimate treatment options?
Well, there's already a lot of promising research underway exploring the therapeutic potential of ayahuasca and DMT for conditions like depression, addiction, and PTSD.
Yeah.
And the early results are encouraging. It's definitely an area to watch closely in the coming years.
So there's real hope on the horizon that these substances might actually offer relief and healing. So people who have exhausted all other treatment options.
Absolutely.
That is a powerful message to end on.
It is. And I think the key takeaway for anyone listening is to stay curious, stay informed, and stay open-minded. The research on DMT and ayahuasca is rapidly evolving, and there's still so much to discover about the potential of these substances to heal, transform, and expand our understanding of the human mind.
Wise words. And remember, the journey of learning is never truly over. There's always more to explore, more to understand. So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep an eye on this exciting field of research. Who knows what incredible discoveries await us in the years to come. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.